It was a quiet morning when Evelyn Hart, the daughter of a powerful Silicon Valley billionaire, stepped onto the marble steps of her family's estate. What she saw lying at her doorstep would forever change the course of her life. A tiny baby, wrapped in a faded pink blanket, cried out for help with no note, no explanation, just an innocent child left alone. Evelyn's world, built on wealth and security, suddenly felt fragile. How would she respond to this shocking discovery? Would her actions save the child, or unravel everything she had carefully built? What would she choose? Evelyn Hart was not the typical billionaire's daughter. At 28, she had already carved her own path, determined to make a name for herself beyond the shadow of her father's tech empire. Richard Hart, her father, was a visionary, founder of a multi-billion-dollar company that had revolutionized the tech industry, but Evelyn had always felt like an afterthought in his grand vision. She had inherited his intellect but none of his drive for the business world. Instead, Evelyn sought purpose elsewhere. She founded a non-profit focused on empowering underprivileged youth to break into the tech industry, a cause she cared about deeply, given her own childhood experience of feeling overlooked and underestimated. Growing up in a house that could have easily been mistaken for a palace, Evelyn was no stranger to luxury. The Hart Mansion was a sprawling estate nestled at the edge of the hills in an exclusive part of the city. Its marble floors, grand staircases and walls, adorned with modern art, echoed wealth. But there was something cold about it. Despite all the beauty, it was a house that lacked warmth, emotionally distant, just like her father. The mansion stood as a testament to her father's success, but Evelyn had often found herself alone in the expansive spaces. Her father was too busy running the company to pay much attention to her, and while their relationship was polite, it was distant. Evelyn had grown used to solitude, spending her evenings working on her non-profit or losing herself in books. It was a comfortable routine, one that kept her mind occupied and her heart at ease. But that morning, as she stepped outside for a quick morning jog, the peaceful rhythm of her life was shattered. There, on the doorstep of her family's mansion, was a bundle, a baby wrapped in a faded pink blanket. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding as the child's cries filled the air. The infant, no more than a few months old, was alone. No note, no explanation, just an innocent life left on her doorstep. For a brief moment, Evelyn couldn't move, her thoughts spinning as the shock of the situation overwhelmed her. Who could have left this child here? And why? There was no logical explanation, no clues to make sense of the situation. All Evelyn could hear were the cries of the baby, echoing through the empty mansion grounds. The discovery left Evelyn with more questions than answers. The world she had known, one of control, precision, and purpose, felt suddenly out of reach. She had no idea how to navigate the situation. A wave of responsibility crashed over her, forcing her to make a choice. Would she call the authorities and hand the baby over to the system, or would she take the child in, despite the overwhelming uncertainty that lay ahead? For the first time in her life, Evelyn realized she could no longer control everything. This moment, this unexpected discovery, would push her to examine the core of who she was and what truly mattered. Her life, which had been defined by wealth and status, would never be the same again. The baby, the unknown past behind it, and the uncertain future that awaited her were now her responsibility, and Evelyn had no choice but to confront it head-on. Rising action. Evelyn's initial shock turned into a whirlwind of decisions. She paced back and forth on the mansion's front steps, the infant still in her arms. The cries were sharp and desperate, piercing the air, demanding action. But Evelyn, usually composed and thoughtful, had no idea what to do next. She wasn't a mother, and she hadn't even been around children much in her life. Her experience in life had been more about numbers, plans, and solving problems within her non-profit, not nurturing and caretaking. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. There was no one around. Her father had already left for his early morning meetings, and the staff wouldn't arrive until later. She glanced at the baby, whose face was scrunched in distress. She knew this child needed immediate care, but she wasn't sure if she should take responsibility. Was this even her place? The uncertainty gnawed at her. The stark reality of the situation made her question her next steps. She had to decide, would she call the authorities and let them take over, or would she take a more personal approach? But there was more to consider than just the immediate logistics. The baby had been left at her door, which meant that someone trusted her enough to care for it. Someone who perhaps had no other options, or maybe even no one else to turn to. What kind of world was she living in where people felt forced to abandon a child like this? The deeper she thought, the harder it became to ignore the weight of this decision. Evelyn's world, the world of wealth and privilege, felt suddenly distant, disconnected from the very real, very human struggles she had spent her adult life trying to help through her non-profit. Yet, here was a living example of that struggle right on her doorstep. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the baby. This moment felt like an intersection of all her past decisions, the work she'd done to help underprivileged youth, the calls to action she had made to people with power, and the disconnect she felt from her father's world of corporate control. Everything was converging. Was she really doing enough? Was her privilege only an illusion, a shield against the true weight of responsibility? At that moment, the front door opened behind her, and Mrs. McKinley, the housekeeper who had worked for the Hart family for over 20 years, stepped out. Her face, always calm and unflappable, shifted into one of concern as she looked at the child in Evelyn's arms. "Miss Hart," Mrs. McKinley began gently, "I can call the authorities if you want, but maybe we should get the baby inside first." Her voice was steady, but Evelyn could tell that the housekeeper had her own concerns. Evelyn nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude toward the older woman. Mrs. McKinley had always been a stabilizing force in the house, someone who knew the pulse of things. Evelyn walked into the house, the warm air a contrast to the chill she felt outside. Mrs. McKinley led them to the living room, where Evelyn settled into a plush chair, cradling the baby in her arms. For a moment, Evelyn just stared at the infant, unsure of what to do. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the phone being placed on the table next to her. Mrs. McKinley, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen it all, had already dialed the authorities. "Do you want me to stay, Miss Hart?" Mrs. McKinley asked, a slight furrow in her brow. Evelyn shook her head. "No, I need some time to think. You can go back to your duties." After a few moments, Mrs. McKinley left her, and Evelyn was alone with the baby. The house was eerily quiet, and for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt lost in her own life. She had always been driven by a sense of purpose, but this moment felt different. It felt personal in a way that her work never had. She felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her chest. She glanced down at the child again. The infant's cries had softened, and Evelyn instinctively rocked her gently in her arms. Slowly, she started to feel the weight of motherhood, of caring for a life that she had no connection to, but that in this moment seemed like her responsibility. Minutes turned into hours as Evelyn sat with the baby, waiting for the authorities to arrive. Her mind wandered through memories of her childhood, of her distant relationship with her father, and the lack of maternal warmth that had defined her early years. It felt like every decision she had ever made led to this one moment. She had been shaped by her wealth, but this was a different kind of wealth, one she had never experienced before. When the authorities arrived, Evelyn made the decision to speak with them herself. There was no turning back. She had a question for the officer who took charge of the situation. "Do you think that this baby's mother had any choice in leaving her child at my doorstep?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft but full of emotion. The officer, a seasoned man in his mid-40s, looked at her with a long pause. "Hard to say, Miss Hart. There's no telling why people make these kinds of decisions, but from what we can gather, this child was probably abandoned because of circumstances beyond her control. You might be the one person who can give this child a better life." Evelyn's heart sank. She had the resources, the ability, and the privilege to help, but the emotional and ethical responsibility was heavier than any of the wealth she had inherited. The officer continued, "We'll make sure to track down the mother, but the choice to keep the child, that's on you." The next few days were a blur for Evelyn. As the media got wind of the story, headlines began circulating about the billionaire's daughter who had found a baby at her doorstep. At first, Evelyn found the attention overwhelming, but soon she realized that the world was watching her closely. People were looking for something more than a headline. They were looking for someone to stand up and do the right thing. It was during this period of uncertainty and self-reflection that Evelyn met Aidan, a social worker sent by the authorities to assess her situation. Aidan was a no-nonsense type of person, someone who had worked in child welfare long enough to know when someone was ill-prepared for parenthood and when they were genuinely trying to do their best. "What's your plan, Miss Hart?" Aidan asked one afternoon, looking at the baby in Evelyn's arms. Evelyn looked at him, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm trying to do what's best, but I didn't expect any of this." Aidan nodded understandingly. "It's a lot, especially if you haven't been around kids much. But I've seen people in your position make it work. It's about the willingness to be there, to show up every day, even when it's hard." Evelyn felt the weight of those words sink deep into her. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. There were challenges she had never anticipated, and doubts she had to confront. But there was also an undeniable pull toward the child who now depended on her, who had no one else. And slowly, she realized that this unexpected turn in her life wasn't a burden. It was a chance for growth. But would she be able to handle it? Would she sacrifice the life she had planned to embrace a new one that would redefine everything about her? This was her crossroads, and every step forward would be a test of her character, compassion, and strength. Climax. The days following the discovery of the baby at Evelyn's doorstep seemed to drag on in a blur. The media frenzy was relentless, with journalists camped out on her estate, the story spreading like wildfire. Headlines screamed about the billionaire's daughter and her newfound maternal instincts. The pressure from the outside world grew unbearable. Evelyn had never been under such a microscope. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on what she should do with the child, the right thing, the logical thing. But in the whirlwind of public opinion, there was one truth that Evelyn couldn't ignore. She had to make a choice about the baby, and she had to make it soon. In the days since the baby was found, Evelyn had poured her heart into taking care of the infant. She found herself in a strange rhythm, waking up in the early hours, feeding and changing the baby, and comforting it when the cries became too much. But the more she did it, the more she felt the weight of what she was doing, of the commitment she was making. The act of caring for the baby, which had begun as an instinctive emotional response, was now beginning to feel like a burden. Evelyn's life had been about control, certainty, and purpose. Every day had been meticulously planned around her non-profit, meetings, and appearances. The sudden shift of having an infant who was completely dependent on her felt jarring. Evelyn, who was used to decisions made in boardrooms, now found herself making decisions in the quiet corners of her mansion. But it wasn't the life she had envisioned. The baby's cries, the sleepless nights, the constant concern, these were not part of her plan. And then, just when she was beginning to settle into the exhausting routine of motherhood, an unexpected twist shattered the fragile peace she had been trying to hold on to. One evening, as Evelyn was finishing up her late-night work, her phone buzzed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but she picked it up, hoping it wasn't another media inquiry. "Miss Hart," the voice on the other end said, "this is Detective Williams from the police department. We have a lead on the mother of the baby you've been caring for." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this call, but it still hit her with a sense of unease. She had always wondered who the mother was and what circumstances had led her to abandon the child. For the past few days, she had felt a strange sense of ownership over the baby, but deep down, she knew that the infant was not hers. It was just a temporary guardianship. At least, that's what she had told herself. "What have you found?" Evelyn asked, her voice betraying her nervousness. "The mother has been found, Miss Hart. Her name is Clara Davis. She's been in and out of shelters for the past few months, but she's willing to meet with you. She wants to explain her side of things." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. She had imagined many possible scenarios, but this one felt different. The reality of the situation hit her like a freight train. The woman who had abandoned the baby wasn't some nameless stranger. She was someone who had faced hardships of her own. The guilt and anger she had felt toward the unknown mother in the past days were suddenly replaced by confusion and empathy. "I want to meet her," Evelyn said, her voice firm yet shaky. "Set up a meeting." The meeting was scheduled for the following day. Evelyn's mind raced the entire night, torn between anger and curiosity. She could barely sleep, her thoughts swirling with conflicting emotions. What would Clara Davis say? What would she feel toward her? She had spent days caring for the baby, and now she had to face the woman who had left her in the first place. The next day, Evelyn stood in the lobby of her mansion, waiting for Clara to arrive. She was nervous, her palms sweating, her chest tight with the weight of the upcoming conversation. She had no idea how to approach this meeting, no script to follow. But she knew one thing: the truth was coming, and it was time to face it head-on. When Clara finally walked in, it was nothing like Evelyn had imagined. The woman was gaunt, tired-looking, and worn from years of struggle. Her clothes were plain, faded from wear, and her eyes were red from what seemed like days of crying. Evelyn felt a pang of sympathy, but she quickly suppressed it. This was not about sympathy, it was about understanding. It was about hearing the story that had led to this moment. Clara looked at Evelyn for a long time before speaking. "You don't know me, and I don't know you," she began, her voice trembling. "But I know what you must think of me. I'm not proud of what I did, leaving my child like that. But you don't understand. When you've been through what I've been through, sometimes you just don't know what else to do." Evelyn sat quietly, listening. There was anger, yes, but also something else, an ache that she hadn't expected. Clara had chosen to leave the baby on Evelyn's doorstep for reasons that were beyond her control, and that knowledge stirred something deep inside Evelyn. "I don't know what happened to me. I don't even know if I'm worthy to be a mother anymore," Clara continued, her voice breaking. "But I saw the baby. I knew she needed someone who could give her what I couldn't. And I knew, in my heart, that you would be able to give her a better life. I just didn't have any other choice." Evelyn's chest tightened, and for a moment she felt everything she had been holding back, the anger, the confusion, the sense of betrayal, collapse inward. But then something unexpected happened. A flood of empathy washed over her. Clara's words, her pain, were real. This wasn't about a rich girl taking care of an abandoned baby. It was about two women, each in their own way, trying to survive in a world that hadn't been kind to either of them. But the moment Clara had finished speaking, Evelyn made a decision, one that felt more like a choice than a reaction. She stood up, her heart pounding, and walked toward Clara. Gently, she placed her hand on the woman's arm. "You don't have to explain. You don't owe me anything. What matters now is that we take care of her, and we do it together if you're willing." Just as Evelyn thought the situation was beginning to make sense, the doorbell rang unexpectedly, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. A woman in her early 30s entered, wearing a sharp business suit and carrying a folder. It was Jennifer, the family lawyer, a woman who had been in and out of Evelyn's life for years, but who had never played a major role in the decisions Evelyn had made. "Miss Hart," Jennifer said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, but her eyes were cold. "I'm afraid there's a legal issue we need to address." Jennifer handed Evelyn a folder filled with legal papers. "It's come to our attention that your father's company has been looking into adoption procedures for this child. The media has gotten hold of the story, and there's a growing concern that your actions will negatively impact the family's public image. We need to address this matter immediately." The words were a punch to the gut, and Evelyn's world seemed to spiral out of control once again. Jennifer's eyes narrowed, and Evelyn could see the subtle power play behind her words. Her father's influence, the very thing Evelyn had been trying to distance herself from, was making its way into the situation, just as she had feared. This was no longer just about caring for a child. This was about legacy, public opinion, and power. Evelyn felt a deep betrayal stirring inside her. Jennifer's cold smile only deepened Evelyn's resolve. "Your father's wishes must be respected. It's a matter of corporate interest, Miss Hart." The moment was overwhelming. Evelyn felt her life teetering on the edge of a cliff, torn between her desire to do what was right for the baby and the pressure of her father's business empire, a force she couldn't escape. Would she stand up for what she believed in, or would she give in to the system that had always controlled her life? It was a choice between family legacy and personal truth, power and compassion. In the climax of her inner turmoil, Evelyn made a decision, a choice that would forever alter the course of her life. "Leave," Evelyn said coldly, her voice more resolute than she had ever sounded before. "I won't be part of this anymore. The baby stays with me, and if it means I lose everything, so be it." It was a turning point. The world she knew, the world of wealth, power, and business, was crumbling in front of her, but Evelyn felt free for the first time in her life. She had chosen compassion over conformity, and she had chosen her own path, no longer bound by her father's expectations. The weeks that followed Evelyn's defiant decision were transformative, not just for her, but for everyone involved. Evelyn's relationship with Clara, the baby's biological mother, slowly evolved into a partnership rooted in mutual respect and a shared commitment to the child. Clara, who had once been overwhelmed by life's struggles, found a renewed sense of purpose and stability. With Evelyn's guidance, she began attending parenting classes, seeking therapy for her own past trauma, and working toward rebuilding the life she had once thought lost. For Evelyn, the experience of caring for the baby and supporting Clara through her own recovery became an unexpected lesson in selflessness. She had spent much of her life chasing professional success and living up to her father's lofty expectations. But nothing had ever felt as fulfilling as knowing that she had made a real difference in someone else's life, someone who had been abandoned, just as she had sometimes felt abandoned by her own family. As the media frenzy over the billionaire's daughter and the abandoned baby eventually faded, the world took notice of Evelyn's decisions. Instead of following her father's wishes to turn the situation into a corporate story, she turned it into a cause. She launched a new initiative within her non-profit focused on helping at-risk children and families, particularly those caught in the foster system. With the baby now an integral part of her life, Evelyn found herself more committed than ever to changing the system for the better. Her efforts reached far beyond her own mansion walls, touching lives across the country. In the months that followed, Evelyn's father, Richard Hart, came to terms with his daughter's decisions, albeit reluctantly. The businessman who had always focused on profit over people had begun to see the importance of family and compassion. He had been forced to reckon with his own distant relationship with Evelyn and the choices she had made. While he would never fully abandon his world of tech and business, he began supporting Evelyn's non-profit in new ways, funding programs that helped vulnerable families. The baby, whose cries had once felt like an overwhelming burden, had become Evelyn's greatest joy. Her name was Lily, and she grew into a bright, energetic child who brought light into Evelyn's life in ways she had never imagined. Watching Lily take her first steps, speak her first words, and share her first laugh with Clara by her side made every sacrifice worthwhile. Evelyn realized that her life had purpose beyond just her work. It was about love, connection, and helping those who needed it the most. As for Clara, the journey of motherhood, once filled with shame and uncertainty, had been transformed into something beautiful. She was no longer alone in her struggle. The bond she had formed with Evelyn and the baby was a testament to the power of redemption and second chances. Together, they had rewritten their stories. In the end, Evelyn knew that the most valuable thing she had ever given was not wealth, but her time, her care, and her willingness to open her heart to those in need. She had learned that true success didn't come from status or recognition, but from the lives she touched along the way. The journey that started with an unexpected baby on her doorstep had led Evelyn to discover a new definition of family, one built on compassion, shared responsibility, and the belief that no matter how unexpected or difficult life may be, love and understanding are the most powerful forces we have. And it was this realization that left the most lasting impact, not just on Evelyn and Clara, but on everyone who heard their story.